Thank you, everyone, at the outset for joining us today. My name is Will Burns, and I serve as the co-director of the Institute for Carbon Removal Law and Policy at American University in Washington, D.C. I want to apologize at the outset because of some webcam issues. I'm only going to be with you via the audio, and I'll be a floating presence through the rest of the webinar. Is part of our Carbon Removal Explainer series, and today we're going to focus on the potential role of enhanced sequestration of carbon in soils as a strategy for addressing climate change. As a brief means of introduction, a number of recent studies, including the IPCC's 1.5C report, have emphasized the potential critical role of carbon dioxide removal approaches to help us avoid passing the 1.5C or 2C temperature thresholds set forth in the Paris Agreement. However, there's been increasing recognition that the most widely discussed option, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, most likely cannot be deployed sustainably at the levels that are projected as necessary by the end of the century to avoid passing critical temperature thresholds. That is somewhere between 15 to 20 gigatons of carbon dioxide removal annually. This has led to increasing recognition of the need for a portfolio approach to deployment of carbon dioxide options. And for many, this has included a potential role for methods to enhance the uptake of carbon by soils. This webinar will focus on the prospects and the challenges associated with this approach. To help us discuss this topic, I'm pleased to have three experts in the field join us today. First, Jason Funk, who is principal and founder of the Land Use and Climate Knowledge Initiative, as well as a senior fellow at our institute. Second of all, Johannes Lehmann, who is a professor and soil scientist at Cornell University's School of Integrative Plant Sciences. And finally, Jeffrey Creque, who serves as director of rangeland and agroecosystem management at the Carbon Cycle Institute in Petaluma, California. In terms of our format today, each of our speakers will initially make brief presentations of approximately 10 minutes apiece, and then we will take questions from our online audience. In this context, I'd like to ask Amanda Borth, the Institute's project director, to explain the logistics for the Q&A portion of the webinar. Amanda?
All right, thank you everyone for joining. So like Will mentioned, just a few quick logistics about joining this webinar. So as you join, your audio and your video is automatically turned off. Please do not try to turn that on so we don't disturb the speakers throughout our program. As we start our Q&A, you can use the chat box to chat your questions and I will field those questions. If you're using a mobile device, the chat box is a little trickier to find. It's going to be in your participants icon, and then you'll be able to find the chat. All right, back to you, Will. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Amanda. And with that, I'd like to turn things over initially to Jason Funk.
Okay, thanks, Will, and thanks to the Institute. This is a great pleasure for me to have the chance to kick off this webinar today. I'm going to share some slides, just a handful of slides to give an overview about some recent understanding about the science of soil carbon sequestration, the practices involved, and how we might work toward incentivizing those practices through policy schemes. So if I can just share my screen, Amanda, you might have to give me permission to do that, I think.
All right, Jason, you should be good to go now to share your screen. Wonderful.
Okay, you're seeing the title slide there. All right, so that's me, and I'm, as Will mentioned, founded a group called this Land Use and Climate Knowledge Initiative. Let me just jump straight into the science here. So for me, the most comprehensive bit of science that's come out recently on this topic came from Jonathan Sanderman and colleagues in 2017. They did a global study to look at the soil carbon losses that we've experienced in post-industrial times. And they used that to try to quantify how much of that soil carbon could be recovered in these areas in a global assessment. And if you tally up that work across the globe, you can see, based on the shading here, that there are many places where we could add small amounts of soil carbon. But overall, when we add that up globally, we're looking at about 320 gigatons of CO2 equivalents that could be restored in soil carbon if we can get back about 2/3 of what's been lost. So just to give you a sense of perspective, the IPCC report that Will just mentioned estimates that we've got a remaining carbon budget of about 420 gigatons if we want to have a reasonable chance of staying below 1.5 degrees of warming. So if we, in fact, sequestered this much carbon in soils and recovered 2/3 of what's been lost, that would increase our carbon budget by about 75% over what's been estimated so far. So that just gives you a sense of how large the scale is of this potential solution worldwide. Now, it's not exactly easy. It's not going to be easy to recover all that soil carbon, but let's talk about some of the ways that we might do that. So this slide just illustrates a few of the practices that have been demonstrated to improve soil carbon in agricultural practices. In the upper left-hand corner, that's an illustration of rotational grazing of livestock. In the center, we see the use of no-till agriculture. In the upper right, there's an illustration of using cover crops. In the lower left, that's an illustration of riparian buffers, which can protect areas that would otherwise be losing a lot of carbon and actually helps to recover some of the carbon in those areas. And then in the lower right, actually, that's an image of a perennial grain that's been specifically developed for this purpose so that it helps to build soil carbon without requiring the annual disturbance of soil. That's a bit more experimental, but this just shows you that these things are available. They're out there in the field. And to some degree, they've been demonstrated to have this impact that we're looking for. Next, I'm going to talk about one of the challenges of why this work hasn't really taken hold as widely as we would like, or what some of the challenges are going to be if we want to get to that global scale of implementation. This slide illustrates one of the main challenges, which is the estimation process of how much soil carbon are we getting out of these practices, how much is already there, and can we quantify the change that occurs. And I'm just using some shorthand titles to talk about the different ways that we can conduct that estimation process and the quantification. So one way is to use remote sensing technologies to look at areas of bare soil and compare changes or index them to known areas over time. That actually tends to be the lowest cost approach, but it also has the highest uncertainty associated with it. Another approach is to use the verification of practices that are happening in the field and then link that to empirically based models that can tell us with some degree of certainty what to expect from those practices if we keep conducting them. The next approach is to use the verification of proxy indicators. So things like noticing that there are certain types of seasonal grasses in an area that's been managed for rangeland. Those can indicate that below the soil, there's a lot of soil carbon there. And those indicators can be tracked over time to monitor changes and estimate them. And then the most reliable method is to simply sample the carbon in fields or in pastures, bring it back to the laboratory, and measure very precisely what's there. So that last approach is something that we've been doing for a very long time. It's very precise, and we have a long record of understanding what that means, but it's also the most costly. And so until now, it's been pretty prohibitive to do that in a widespread way. And there hasn't been much of an incentive for farmers and ranchers to employ those kinds of techniques because there's not a lot of incentive for them to build up carbon in the soil. So that's one of the challenges, is the fact that Scientifically, it's difficult. Some of these things are hard to observe. The process of quantification has challenges and costs associated with it. And unless there's some compensation on the other side of that, farmers and ranchers just don't really have a good reason to go out and make sure that these practices are in fact sequestering soil carbon. Many of these types of practices do have other types of co-benefits associated with them, and there are some incentives for those things. So we'll get to that toward the end of these slides. I want to give you just an indication of the kinds of tools that are associated with these different sorts of estimation and verification practices. So remote sensing, for example, can be done through satellite or airborne technologies. In the US, there's a use of a model that's been built up over time from empirical measurements in the field called Comet Farm. So that's one tool that we have for linking practices that we can observe to empirical estimates built around modeling. The verification of proxy indicators usually requires a field visit and inspection. So that's what's illustrated here in this third image. And then lab sampling and measurement is something that's been going on, as I said, for a very long time, and we have good practices for how to do that. I'm just going to shift into this discussion then of how could we try to tackle incentivizing these practices and striking a balance between making it attractive for farmers and ranchers to do these practices and also sort of linking those incentives as directly as possible to the kinds of soil carbon sequestration that we're looking for to help hit those global goals. So I've listed 4 different types of approaches here just to give you a sense of the different ways we might try to build these incentives and how they relate to this process of estimation and the practices in the field. So the first one is to directly incentivize carbon storage, which requires some precise quantification, and that, as we've talked about, is costly. And this could be done through something like an offsetting system where farmers, we quantify what's happening in their fields and we pay them for every ton of carbon, let's say. It can also be done by indirectly incentivizing carbon sequestration by rewarding practices that we can demonstrate have, in general, a carbon sequestration benefit through things like conservation programs. So conservation programs already exist within the US Farm Bill and in many other places. And we could modify those conservation programs in ways that make sure that we are, in fact, incentivizing carbon sequestration practices. A third way is to modify the eligibility requirements for some of the existing supports that we provide to agriculture, which aren't necessarily directly linked to carbon sequestration, but we make the eligibility contingent on the fact that farmers are using these types of practices in order to access a benefit that they already enjoy or would like to enjoy, such as crop insurance. And then the fourth approach that I've listed here is to simply rely on private markets and perhaps support those types of activities by providing technical support, for example, through agricultural extension services or university research and technical support. And those private markets could incentivize these practices through things like sustainable certification that then consumers would look for and be willing to pay a premium for these kinds of things. So all of these examples exist in different parts of the world. And I just want to give a flavor for the different ways that policies could be designed to do this in a more robust way. We currently don't have a system in the US that directly incentivizes soil carbon sequestration, but many people who are advocating for climate policy changes see this as part of the overall picture. But as you can tell, because of the diversity of different ways that we could do that, there isn't complete agreement here about how these things should be incentivized. And of course, the costs and the cost effectiveness of these approaches is something that would have to be considered for any type of policy package. So that's just a quick overview of kind of the scale of the potential, the types of challenges, particularly with estimation, the sorts of practices that can deliver these benefits, and then the kinds of policy approaches that we could use to incentivize those practices and get that benefit. So I'll wrap things up and hand them off to the other speakers now. Thanks.
All right. Thank you very much for that, Jason. Our second speaker is Professor Johannes Lehmann, and he will focus on the potential role of a process called biochar in terms of enhancing soil carbon sequestration. Professor Lehmann?
Thank you very much for organizing this exciting webinar, and thanks to the other speakers. So as introduced, I would like to focus on biochar systems, and just want to highlight very early on that the word systems is quite important in that, because although biochar as conceived by many would end up or be added to soil, there is a decisive need to look at the life cycle emissions reduction and generation in the entire system. But for all intents and purposes, it's usually called a soil carbon sequestration technique. This approach was initially motivated by observations in our natural environment and our environment that has been anthropogenically modified over the history of the Earth and the history of humanity, specifically more recently in the last 30 years or so by anthropogenic soils found in the central Amazon that are called Terra Preta Gingio, that showed very fertile soils in an otherwise very infertile soilscape. And what was interesting to see that the majority of the carbon in the soil had this biochar type form and was very old, much older than other carbon in soils usually to be expected. So that motivated the initial inquiry to look at char type carbon. Char is organic material such as leaves, wood, but also animal manures or other what's called usually waste materials, heated in the absence or under oxygen-starved conditions. And under these conditions, polyaromatic structures are formed that increasingly form sheets at higher temperatures, going towards, but never really reaching forms that we usually associate with graphene structures. At higher condensation, we typically see that the persistence of the char in the environment, in the soil environment, increases, and at high molecular condensation, at so-called hydrogen to carbon ratios of less than 0.4, the materials that have been tested so far in the global literature exceed typically a mean residence time of 1,000 years. So that material seems to be more persistent than any other soil amendment that we can think of, and that stimulated thinking about putting char carbon in soil and looking at a global potential to sequester carbon, and as I said earlier, to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions as a whole, but I'll get back to that. These biochar type carbons are actually not just an anthropogenic remnant of habitation as shown in the Brazilian case, although that is widespread all over the world and includes fire management by Aboriginal populations in many regions. It is simply also a normal behavior in the Earth system. Carbon cycles, we find biochar type soil carbon all around the world at various concentrations, as you can see here from this global study. But rather than characterizing biochar as a material, biochar should be really seen as a system whereby materials have to be transformed by a process called pyrolysis, and that generates the solid char, and at the same time volatile carbons and gases are generated that can be refined into all kinds of materials, whether that is bioenergy, electricity, or biofuels, a variety of liquid fuels, or food products and other modern products. But as you can see, we have to recognize that materials have to be brought into a pyrolysis, they have to be returned to the soil, and there are various trade-offs between producing fuel and solids, and with the variety of different inputs, you can imagine that there are many different considerations for how effective a certain pyrolysis biochar system is for reducing greenhouse gas emissions and sequestering carbon in soil. The underlying big thought in this is that by charring a portion of net primary productivity that would otherwise return the CO2 from the soil to the atmosphere very rapidly as part of the annual cycle of growth and litter production and decomposition in soil, deviating some of that carbon from a rapid biological cycle into a much slower geogenic pyrolysis cycle reduces atmospheric CO2 concentration. But as I said, rather than looking at biochar as a material that we add to soil, we have to consider what it is made from, and how do we make it, and where is it land applied, and what effects does it have. And as you can imagine, there are other fluxes than just carbon, but also, or other than CO2, but also other greenhouse gases such as methane and nitrous oxide that could offset or improve greenhouse gas emission reductions by biochar itself. These so-called life cycle assessments are done, increasingly done with many approaches to mitigate climate change. And as you can see from this compilation of studies, most of the dots are above the zero line, so they indeed abate CO2 equivalents, and in these kinds of analysis, non-CO2 emissions are included. So from transportation or fertilizer, changes in fertilizer use efficiencies are already considered. When we look at the climate change mitigation potential on a global scale and compare those with greenhouse gas emission reductions from combustion, we'll see that here the straight lines are always, and all of the scenarios, the different colors are different scenarios, are always above, the pyrolysis line is always above the combustion line. So it seems in a direct comparison between bioenergy production through combustion and bioenergy production through biochar, pyrolysis and biochar sequestration, biochar pathway offers some advantages in terms of greenhouse gas emission reductions. These kind of analysis have to be seen as a probing the potential, and in this case, there are different assumptions that are made, how much biomass can be selected, but those are no, not projections, can't be seen as projections, but merely as probing the technical potential. You can think about it as not to exceed numbers under the scenarios probed. If we compare biochar greenhouse gas emission reduction and carbon sequestration with other soil carbon greenhouse gas emission approaches, on the upper left side, you see numbers for biochar compared to other approaches that include reducing tillage or restoring degraded land or better rice management or restoring histosols and tillage. You'll see that the number is relatively large compared to other approaches, but it also requires a huge area. That's why it's on the upper side here. Whereas other approaches have a greater efficiency per unit area. So those are, of course, considerations that would need to be adopted on a large scale, and that bears its own challenges in rolling out a global program rather than having a very focused program at one location. However, it seems in comparison to one of the workhorses of carbon removal, so-called BECCS, that was mentioned earlier, it seems that the biochar approach, which is acronym here as BEBCS, so BEPS, biochar and bioenergy and biochar carbon sequestration, offers an approach that might be economically feasible at a lower carbon price. And I want to leave you with the last slide, thinking about it strategically, and this applies, of course, to soil carbon sequestration as a whole, but also in this discussion of whether we want to focus on BECCS or we want to look at other approaches. The strategy that we will adopt, or where we would put our main emphasis, apart from the fact that we would like and have to have a portfolio of approaches, is also a geostrategic discussion. Where do we want to have photosynthetically fixed carbon be located on Earth? Do we want to return it as energy and inject it into deep earth, or do we want to maximize the benefit of photosynthetically fixed carbon to add it to soil? And that applies to biochar as well as to any other soil carbon sequestration approach. And with that, I'll leave you and look forward to the discussion later on.
Great. Thank you so much for that, Johannes. Our last speaker is Jeff Creque. And Jeff will discuss some of the work of his institute as a kind of a case study of how we might operationalize some of the concepts and strategies that we've discussed to this point. Jeff?
Great, thanks very much, Will, and thanks, Jason, for that excellent introduction, and Johannes for that really wonderful overview of biochar systems, as you say. I'm going to bring up some slides. Let's see here. Okay, can you see that? Okay. A group of us came together in 2008 in Marin County, which is a small county, coastal county just north of San Francisco, really to engage the question of the role of agriculture in climate change and how that role might be positive. And really the question we started with was, could we measure a change in soil carbon in our what are fundamentally grassland agroecosystems in Marin County and across California? To just test this very simple question, could we measure a small change in soil carbon that might result from a management change? We decided to add some carbon to the system and then come in and see if we could measure it. So we partnered with Dr. Wendy Silver's lab at UC Berkeley on this project. And in 2008, we put literally half an inch of compost out onto grazed grasslands in Marin and Yuba counties. So Marin on the coast, Yuba County in the Sierra foothills. And then now Dr. Becker-Riles conducted her doctoral research on what happened next. So this is compost going out on the Yuba County site. Right away, the first spring of the year, we noticed cattle were gravitating to the compost treated plots over the untreated or the controls. Which we thought was quite humorous, but when we analyzed the forage, we realized the cattle were actually selecting the higher protein grasses that were growing on the compost treated plots. So that was a pretty interesting result. In addition, we saw much higher production on the compost treated plots, about a 40% increase on the relatively mesic coastal site, and about a 70% increase on the drier foothill site. What was interesting is that each year, as we were collecting new data, we were seeing a similar relative increase in forage production, although we only added compost in the first year of this 4-year experiment. Similarly, we found and were able to measure changes in soil carbon over the period of the study, which of course was what we had set out to test, to see whether we could in fact measure a small change. And we found that we were able to measure a change. And this represents an increase in soil carbon above and beyond the compost itself, because we knew exactly how much carbon we had put on with the compost. And what we were seeing was a net increase in photosynthetic capture of carbon in the soil, which was reflected in the above ground increase in biomass as well. We also measured an increase in soil water holding capacity, which of course was very probably a principal driver of that increase in forage production that we measured. So this was pretty exciting. Dr. Riles subsequently put this data into a model using DayCent and looked at what the long-term implications of this activity might be. The hockey stick curve you see there is the compost decay curve. So a big slug of carbon goes into the system in year 1 in the form of compost, gradually decays over several decades, but the ecosystem response is a scatter plot behind that, showing that as carbon, because of the increased productivity in response to the compost, the system begins to build on itself. And we see basically the initiation of a positive feedback cycle whereby increased photosynthetic capture of carbon is leading to changes in the soil system, which are driving increased photosynthetic capture of carbon. And this continues, according to the model, for several decades. And even a century out, we're still looking at more carbon in the system than we started with. This work is now being replicated across California. This is some data, obviously modeled, but using initial data from 15 plots across the state, looking at several different counties, several different soils, and climatic regimes across California. We're seeing essentially very similar results, at least initial results, to the Marin and Yuba County projects. Similarly, USGS in the recent California Fourth Climate Assessment looked at the question of what would it mean hydrologically for the state, for the working lands of the state, which were basically defined by the grasslands, the grazed grasslands and arable lands in California. So about 43 million acres or so, 44 million acres. What if we increased soil organic matter on those 44 million acres by 1%, 2%, 3%? And that's the data you see here. Significant increases in water holding capacity really across all soils in the state, some more so than others, but clearly fairly significant in the state of California, where water is a very limiting factor. With a 3% increase on 44 million acres, the model suggests we'd be looking at about 6 million acre feet of hydrological benefit across California. Of course, we've all been thinking about the 4 per 1,000 initiative. France, California, Netherlands, and others have joined this. We did a thought exercise for California. What would this mean for the state if we were to actually do this in California? Looking at this top line here is sort of what the NRCS, Natural Resources Conservation Service, is doing with respect to conservation practices in California and the greenhouse gas implications of that. So by 2030, at current rates, we're looking at about 7.7 million metric tons of additional CO2 sequestered through various conservation practices. If we adopted a 4 per 1,000 approach, and rather than this very small acreage that's currently being engaged, if we engaged 3% of our arable lands, just looking at our 20 million acres or so of arable lands in California now. So at about 600,000 acres per year, by 2030, we'd be looking at about 59 million metric tons of CO2 above and beyond baseline conditions. By 2050, we're looking at about 146 million metric tons of CO2, having engaged, theoretically, by that time, all 20 million acres of the state's arable lands. So again, just a thought exercise, current ag emissions in California, 36 million metric tons. So we clearly have the potential to at least offset that and do much better as well. Unfortunately, our Air Resources Board in California has set a very modest goal, which we think is really unfortunate, 15 to 20 million metric tons by 2030. And we're, of course, working hard to convince them that there's much greater opportunity than that. So examples, soil carbon sequestration rates. This is from the recent National Academy report, but I've added a line here. This is all primarily grassland interventions and estimated soil organic carbon sequestration rates on a per hectare per year basis. What we're finding as we develop our carbon farm program across California is we're anticipating about 1 3/4 metric tons of CO2e across carbon across per hectare per year, based on what are now 41 working carbon farms in California. This is an example from one of our farms, tying in the implications from a biodiversity perspective of increasing working land carbon. This is a 30-year riparian restoration project. It obviously started in very degraded condition. We're now looking at a very complex, structurally diverse system with a lot of fixed carbon. We've actually got some data on this from some work that UC Extension did, University of California Cooperative Extension, and 30 species of migratory birds nesting in here based on data that Point Blue Conservation Science has been monitoring this for throughout this period. So we're really pretty bullish about this concept of a climate beneficial agriculture. This is an example from one of our working carbon farms up in the high desert in northeastern California, working on a wool production ranch. This is a compost operation that was started as part of that carbon farm planning effort. And how are we quantifying this? And Jason touched on this early on. We're basically using models based on practices and consequently able to, drawing from the USDA Blue Book, which underlies tool, online tool, Comet Planner, which is sort of an offshoot of the Comet Farm tool developed at Colorado State. We're able to put some numbers on these things. So here's an example, a summary table from a working carbon farm, practices that would be implemented under the carbon farming framework, the average annual sequestration rate based on implementation of those practices, and then a longer term 20-year horizon, about 100,000 metric tons of CO2e sequestered on about a 4,300 acre project. When we look at a life cycle assessment for wool production in the region and compare that to the carbon farm plan results, we're looking at offsetting something like 6 to 10 times the emissions from that wool production operation, if in fact their carbon farm plan is fully implemented. This work was recognized and supported by the North Face, who is currently using wool from this operation to develop their climate beneficial line of clothing. They produced a hat, a scarf, and a jacket, I believe, to date. And we realize, as this quote represents from the producer, we're as much in the process of producing carbon farmers as we are in promoting the idea of carbon farming. Organic Valley, some of you may be familiar with. Recently, we completed 3 carbon farm plans in our region in collaboration with Organic Valley, and they're using this as a marketing tool in promoting their products. Just to close up, we've faced a similar crisis in the past, and we addressed it by developing both the Conservation Service, now the Natural Resources Conservation Service, and the Resource Conservation Districts, which exist at the county level in virtually every county in the country. We're currently working with about 32 of the 98 resource conservation districts across California, and collaborating with some land trusts and other private land owners and managers to develop this, flesh out this carbon farming planning process across the state. And it's really essential, I think, when Jason outlines the various strategies, the bottom line question is, how do we get this on the ground? And the resource conservation districts are there on the ground. They're not all functional, but many of them are very functional, have some very good, highly qualified staff, and are able to actually develop these plans and actually begin to work on the ground in collaboration with their producer community. So the good news, I think, is the opportunity is there. As we all know, we have very, very little time to actually start this work and get it going at scale. So I'll close there.
Great. Thank you very much for that, Jeff. And with that, I'd like to open it up to questions from the online participants. As I said, Amanda will field those questions and distribute them to the appropriate presenters. Amanda?
All right, great. So you can all start populating the chat box with some questions that we can send over to our presenters.
This is Benoit speaking.
Yeah.
You hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
I'd like to ask a question to Johannes Lehmann.
Okay, go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, Johannes. Hope you.
Hello.
I wanted to have your opinion on the use of biochar into industrial products as cement, plastic, packaging. There's about 15 products that have been named in the book that just came out, Burn, Using Fire to Cool the Earth. Thank you.
Thank you, Benoit. Yeah, well, you're talking with a soil scientist, right? So obviously my knowledge is limited about the technical feasibility and potential, and also the life cycle impact of use in those materials compared to other materials. But it strikes me that there are some good reason to offset fossil fuel use, or in some cases cement use, in some cases sand use for biochar in certain products. Not just because it offsets those uses, but because it lends an improved property to the product. And I think then it makes even more sense, and that requires careful product development with biochar materials. I do think that there are knock-on effects that Jeff explained that go beyond just stuffing the carbon somewhere, and those may be the ones that not only for greenhouse gases and carbon sequestration, but also for environmental purposes we might be very interested in. But that's a really general answer, and obviously you've been asking about many different approaches, but I probably need to leave it as that.
Thank you.
All right. Great, thank you, Johannes. So one question that I have that popped up in the chat box is, how do the presenters suggest to ensure permanence of soil sequestration? I know this is a big topic that we tend to grapple with a lot in this field, and if anybody would like to chime in on that, and I can repeat the question if needed.
I'd like to jump in on that, if I may.
Yeah.
I'm much more interested in the direction of flow of carbon than I am in its permanence.
Mm-hmm.
I like the idea of increasing the rate of flow into the soil system, but because the soil is a living system, and because we're talking about a living system at the planetary scale, we will always be emitting CO2 as long as there's life on the planet. So there's going to be this constant flux in and out of the atmosphere. The question is, what is the net direction of flow? And I think the soil offers us that really unique opportunity to see a directional flow that is actually fundamentally beneficial, unlike the atmosphere.
Yeah, I can give just 30 seconds extend. I completely agree with that, and no, it is maybe even a misnomer to to talk about carbon sequestration in soils, because it's not really putting carbon in soils and locking it away for all time. It is managing the flow of carbon in soil and the earth, as Jeff explained very well. So I think that is, and although it is tempting to think about biochar in locking away forever, that's also not correct. So in some ways, sequestration is a misnomer, but it is a management of flow, and it has to be a flow, because otherwise the soil will not work. It's just the valve that we are looking at, and the knock-on positive effects that we're really interested in reaping for the long term.
Great, thank you. And Jason, any notes on that before we move on?
Just
Nope.
by way of analogy, one way to think about this is a bank account, and my bank account has flows coming in and flows going out, but I'm able to keep track of how much is in there overall. And if that number is getting bigger, then I'm happy, even though I'm not tracking the individual dollars that went into or out of that account. Another way to think about it is like a bathtub. I think Johannes was alluding to that as well. That map that I showed at the beginning of my presentation sort of gives you the overall sense of how much capacity could we fill up in this soil carbon bathtub. And that involves tweaking both how much is flowing into it through the kinds of practices that we've discussed in this webinar, and also making sure that we're not letting too much of it leak back out again. So there are a number of different ways to kind of conceptualize this, and I think using the term permanent sort of obscures some of the nuances there.
All right, thank you. Looking at the chat box, there's quite a few folks that have asked questions about incentives for farmers. So I'm just going to collect them into one or two questions. So how can we move towards incentivizing carbon storage for current farmers in the current system, as well as compensation in the current system? And then what changes might be need to be made to have more incentives?
That's a question we grapple with a lot, of course. We were glad to see some of the brands stepping up, supporting their farmers in implementing practices, and giving rather nice premiums for products that were coming off of lands that are being managed in this way. That's going to help. It's probably not going to solve the problem. I think culturally, societally, we really need to recognize the value of carbon, and we need to begin to embed that in the prices of goods and in the kinds of supports we bring to agriculture on the land. So we have active conservation programs for agriculture that do provide support. Those programs, in my view, need to be radically expanded, including significant support for the resource conservation districts that are actually doing the work on the ground, the outreach and the technical support with producers. And then recognizing at some level the economic value of the ecosystem services, both carbon and those other services such as water holding capacity, biodiversity, that come along with increasing soil carbon.
Okay, great, thank you. And this question kind of piggybacks off the last question, might be best directed towards Jason. Are there any initiatives to develop model legislation or codes to promote carbon sequestration? And I'll add on to that, if you could explain some gaps that you see where model legislation needs to be added.
Yeah, I mean, there have been a number of different types of models for legislation proposed over the years. I've been involved in this for about a decade, and so I can think back to some of those that have come along. I think there's been a general idea, at least in the past few years, that it would make the most sense to modify some of the Farm Bill provisions that we already have in place and some of the programs that are already there, rather than create something brand new from whole cloth. yes, I would say there's a huge number of climate-focused advocates and people who are interested in crafting that legislation who have been thinking about a whole range of different possible models. Too many to really go into detail of any one of them right now. But they sort of cover the range that I mentioned in that last slide, from building up something that's a very specific offset style. We're going to reward each ton of carbon in each field where it gets sequestered, all the way to something that's much more indirect and sort of says, okay, when we think about the portfolio of what's coming out of a whole program across the nation, or that's something that we can plug, incentivize various things, and then we expect a certain level of response in terms of soil carbon out the other side, even if it's not quite as direct and precise. We can't tie it to a particular acre, let's say. So I would say all of those things are on the table. Maybe we don't have time to go into the specifics of particular ones unless somebody has a particular question about one.
Great, thank you. So we're going to jump back to talking about farms for a second. One person asked that they want to know about the resources for farms that wish to model best practices in carbon sequestration, as well as the availability of speakers to prevent webinars in rural Virginia counties on how to get model farms up and running. So what types of resources are currently out there is a big question for these farmers.
Well, in California, this carbon farm program is really taking off. So the RCDs we've engaged are very engaged and are working directly with farmers at the county level. Some of our UC Extension offices are now stepping in as well to provide technical support. And the NRCS, the Natural Resources Conservation Service, in California has developed a carbon farming guidance and is funding specific practices through their EQIP program, Environmental Quality Improvement Program. So those are places I would start. I'm not sure what's happening in Virginia. I know there is a movement in Virginia. I've had some inquiries from folks in Virginia. So again, it may be up to you to start something, but there is growing interest across the country, and you can certainly visit, our websites, both the marincarbon.org and carboncycle.org, and kind of get a sense of what we're doing in California, and maybe build that out for your region.
All right, thank you. This is a really interesting question that just popped up, and I know we kind of grapple with this here at the Institute as well. What's more effective to encourage adoption, carbon offsets projects or regulations? You don't have to choose.
Regulation and agriculture don't go along too well together. What we've seen is that farmers are really ready to step up and be part of the solution, but they want to be seen in a very positive light if they're going to do that. They don't want to be told what to do. And what we've seen with things like TMDLs, total maximum daily loads, around water quality in California, certainly, maybe nationally, is that what we get when we set regulations is we get the low bar, we get the lowest common denominator. People will do that minimum to comply, but they're not going to think outside the box and go further. And the beauty of what we've seen with our work is, as a carbon farm, as that farmer gets it and begins to understand the role of carbon in their agricultural ecosystem and its benefits to them, they start coming up with ideas we hadn't even thought of. So it's really an opportunity here to really expand the vision of agriculture and the opportunity for agriculturalists as well.
All right, thank you.
I'm happy to jump in briefly. I completely agree, and I think that maybe it's an irony that a lot of approaches for soil carbon sequestration come with a negative abatement cost. So in fact, it is money generating rather than costing. But there are hurdles. There are knowledge hurdles. There are real monetary hurdles. all kinds of hurdles. And we know this with no-tillage equipment. A lot of farmers would like to implement no-tillage for all kinds of other reasons than soil carbon sequestration, but of course there are hurdles to implementing, and they're sometimes not going away with just writing a check. So there are many good reasons, and those approaches that the farmer would like to do anyway, that's probably the ones we should start with, and there are many mechanisms to do that, but I recognize that this will always be a portfolio approach as well, and very localized and individualized.
All right, thank you. So I'm going to pull a question that came a little earlier on. Can the carrying capacity of soil for carbon ever be exceeded? So we know that it probably can be exceeded, right? But what would it take to do that, and would we ever be pretty close to that?
I could speak to that a little bit. I had a chance to sort of have a conversation with Jonathan Sanderman, who was the lead author on that study that I showed earlier about this issue. And he said, generally, we expect that we could recover about 2/3 of the carbon that's been lost over since pre-industrial times. But he also speculated that there are technologies like biochar, for example, that could build up carbon beyond some of those levels that existed in pre-industrial times. In some locations, it's unclear if that's generally true around the whole globe. But I think that his point was, our estimates for the pre-industrial levels of soil carbon aren't necessarily an upper limit. They shouldn't be thought of as a carrying capacity, but just a way to gauge our relative, how far we are from what was there before we started really disturbing the soil in a significant way. So I think things like biochar, like compost application, could potentially go beyond that pre-industrial level. And I'm not sure that thinking about it as a carrying capacity really makes sense.
Yeah, those are good points. I completely agree. Here in upstate New York, we have muck soils around, and in many parts of the U.S., there are wetland soils around that have a huge amount of carbon. So in principle, there's not about compromising ecosystem services or crop productivity by the level of carbon anytime soon. You can spin it on and come up with a scenario, but I hope by that time we're out of the worst. There is a carrying or a maximum capacity that's very localized, probably, of what amount you can add per unit time, and without, for instance, causing nitrogen immobilization or phosphorus immobilization or any other allelopathic effects of whatever you're adding. So those are all manageable and would not constrain a global response, because we can't get that much organic matter in one go anyways. So I don't think that that carrying capacity for other ecosystem services is constraining us in this approach.
So we're getting towards time, so we're going to end the Q&A now. For those of you who weren't able to get their questions answered, my email was on the Eventbrite page, so feel free to shoot me an email with your questions and we'll be happy to get you answers. So we'll wrap up here, and Will, would you like to make some closing comments?
Yes, I'd just like to thank everyone. First of all, the speakers for the excellent presentations and participation in the Q&A period, and our online participants, again, for some excellent questions that help stimulate discussion about both potential and challenges to utilizing this approach. I think we can all agree that it is one of the potential extremely salutary part of the carbon dioxide removal portfolio, and I appreciate everybody's participation. If you're interested in hearing about our future webinar plans, please feel free to send us a message to join our mailing list. We use it sparingly, but one of the things we use it for is to announce future episodes of the webinar. And with that, I will close the webinar. And again, thank you very much.